I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report on the destruction wrought by intense fighting in Donetsk, consider new indications of what Zelensky's victory plan entails, and hear a sobering assessment of the current situation on the battlefield from somebody frequently there.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 15th of October, 2 years and 239 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and Francis Farrell of the Kyiv Independent, who has spent a considerable amount of time on the front lines in recent months. I started by asking Dom, however, for the latest battlefield updates from Ukraine and Russia.
There are no intact buildings or shelters left in Donetsk. That's in Donetsk Oblast. This comes from Anastasia Bobokinova, the spokesperson for the operational tactical group Luhansk, speaking yesterday. Now, Roland yesterday spoke of how Donetsk, that town, it's about 40 km north of Donetsk city, about the same distance east-northeast of Pokrovsk, has been under extreme pressure in recent weeks. You may remember last Friday, I quoted local Ukrainian authorities as saying that Kyiv controlled about 40, or roughly, they said 40 to 50% of the town. That was Friday, continued pressure over the weekend. And now Ms. Bobonikova says, now the town looks more like a desert planet. There are no shelters for civilians or soldiers, and unfortunately this allows the enemy to occupy new areas, but on scorched earth. Now, speaking on national television, she also alleged that Russian soldiers are changing their military uniforms for civilian clothes to move towards Ukrainian positions. Now, we've got no way of verifying that, but if true, that would be a war crime. So I had a look at this. I've been very careful. I checked the International Committee for the Red Cross, their definitions and the interpretation of humanitarian law. The ICRC lists a number of acts that are considered perfidious, i.e. committing the act of perfidy, if committed with the intent to betray the confidence of the adversary. Now, one such act is the, quote, simulation of civilian status because civilians not taking a direct part in hostilities must be respected and may not be the object of attack, unquote. Now, I say I've been very careful because that is different to soldiers, usually special forces troops, special ops forces troops in civilian attire, conducting reconnaissance or otherwise operating in and amongst the enemy. They are not taking a direct part in hostilities, i.e. seeking to engage with direct fire. Now, additional Protocol 1 to the Hague Regulations being one of the key pieces of the architecture of international humanitarian law, prohibits the act, quote, to kill, injure or capture an adversary by resort to perfidy. So we will keep an eye on this because that is a very strong allegation and a very worrying development if Russian soldiers are trying to use the cover of civilian identity and the protections a civilian is afforded under international humanitarian law to then conduct direct military activities. So that's why I sort of labour that point. Now, elsewhere, a Russian missile strike last night on the southern city of Mykolaiv killed 1, injured 23. This comes from Governor Vitaly Kim reporting this morning. That was one of a number of attacks across the country that left 5 dead and dozens injured. Most of this reporting comes from the Kyiv Independent. They're saying that Russian forces struck the city of Mykolaiv with S-300 anti-aircraft missiles around 2:30 a.m. this morning. They say an industrial facility, restaurant complex, shops and residential buildings were damaged, according to the local governor. Now, 3 Shahed-type drones were downed elsewhere in Mykolaiv Oblast. That comes from a total of 17 fired last night by Russia. 12 were shot down, 4 more described as lost, which is generally taken to mean either brought down or disappeared back to Belarus or Russia by electronic warfare methods. Now, you remember yesterday, if you listened, Roland noted that there were no drone strikes overnight Sunday, Monday, the first night, as he said, in well over a month. I think it was 50-something days that there'd been regular drone incursions overnight and drone attacks. Yesterday was the first day for a long time that there had not been. 17 last night, not a huge number, but back to that regular drumbeat. Additionally, 7 S-300 or 400 variant missiles were used against Mykolaiv Oblast and 2 Kh-59 missiles in Chernihiv. This comes from the Air Force, Ukraine's Air Force. In Kherson Oblast, Russian forces targeted 22 settlements, including the city of Kherson. 4 killed, 6 injured. This comes from Governor Alexander Prokudin. Now, elsewhere, Russia plans to involve North Korea directly in the war against Ukraine in the coming weeks, President Zelensky said yesterday, citing reports from his intelligence agencies. Again, Roland mentioned yesterday that President Zelensky had warned over the weekend of what he called a quote, increasing alliance between Moscow and Pyongyang. But according to Ukraine's military intelligence, Russia plans for this autumn and winter include, quote, the actual involvement of North Korea in the war, President Zelensky said. As a reminder, on Sunday, Mr. Zelensky said this is no longer just about transferring weapons, it is actually about transferring people from North Korea to the occupying military forces. There were some suggestions that North Korean engineers were killed in one of the Ukrainian strikes against an arms depot. Not confirmed, very difficult to confirm that, and obviously North Korea and Russia have not said anything, but they were thought to have been there in that blast a few weeks ago. And the next one comes from Reuters. Interesting story. This NATO will not be cowed by Russian threats, but will keep up its support of Kyiv. NATO's new Secretary General Mark Rutte has said on his first visit to Germany, actually in his first visit to NATO's Ukraine mission in Wiesbaden, Germany. That's the place that's going to take over the coordination of military aid from the US. In a joint interview with Reuters and the German public radio Hessischer Rundfunk, Mark Rutte gave a message to Putin. He said, the message is that we will continue, that we will do what's necessary to make sure he will not get his way, that Ukraine will prevail. As I said, he was speaking on his first visit to Germany as the new NATO chief, visited Clay Barracks. That's the US base hosting this new headquarters, or the headquarters for this new mission, the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine mission, NSATU, I suppose we're going to be calling that, NSATU. Anyway, that is going to gradually assume the role of coordination of all Western military aid to Kyiv. Reuters saying that is being interpreted as an effort to safeguard that aid mechanism against a possible return of Donald Trump in next month's election in the US. Now, I mean, of course, that whole military aid effort is very largely underpinned by the US. So even if Donald Trump gets in, just the setting up of NSATU is not a guarantee that it will be all be rosy. And of course, we will keep tabs on it. This headquarters is expected to be in total about 700 personnel, including troops from NATO's military headquarters at SHAPE. That's the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, which is just down the road from Brussels itself, about 40 k's or what have you, southwest. It's a bit ramshackle. It's a bit sort of porter cabin on a car park chic, but it is the actual sort of military headquarters bit, and the political headquarters of NATO, if you like, is up in Brussels itself. NSATU is also going to include logistics hubs in Poland and Romania. And then finally for me, Francis, an interesting article by our colleague Iona Kyiv. She's been looking at the story of Russian soldiers that have been recruited by Artesh, the underground Ukrainian resistance movement. Now, one such soldier recruited as a double agent by Ukraine described to the Telegraph how he set fire to his own trench, destroying a large number of military supplies, injuring, he says, about 20 Russian troops. In a rare interview, the conscript soldier told Iona that he set fire to his unit's trench on the left bank of the Dnieper River in July. He said, I think I did my job well, maybe even more so. The results exceeded our expectations. I'm flagging it here. It went up over the weekend, actually, but I'm flagging it here in case folk missed it. It's an interesting look at an area we don't often manage to turn the torch to, the recruitment of Russian soldiers to the resistance movements. It's underreported, little known. A nice article there from Iona. That's us up to date, Francis.
Thanks, Dom. As you say, the subject of Ukrainian resistance in all forms doesn't get the attention it deserves. It's vital, particularly when we talk about the occupied territories, to remember that there are many operations taking place there, from small acts of resistance by the local population to quite major sabotage by soldiers and others. So we mustn't forget that this is an ongoing struggle in the occupied territories. They are not just lost to Moscow, but you would think that given some of the language used by Western politicians. But turning to the political updates now, we spoke last week about Zelensky's spontaneous European tour to sell leaders his so-called victory plan, speculating that we would likely hear more details as the days went on. Well, there's been nothing major, but as we assumed, according to the Wall Street Journal, it does include Storm Shadow and ATACMS missile requests specifically, and permission to use them on Russian soil. That is coming straight from the key presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak, who I interviewed back on video in Kyiv in February. I think we saw that as a given, frankly, but it does tally with reports that much of the plan includes detailed requests for certain weapons and permissions from Europe. One of the most notorious weapons Kyiv has not been given by Europe, of course, is Germany's Taurus missiles, the subject of quite an intense row in Berlin, with Chancellor Olaf Scholz making it clear following that vote in Parliament a few months ago that he wouldn't give them. But the German opposition is now saying that it would deliver Taurus to Ukraine after certain steps. First, it says there should be an appeal to Putin to stop attacking civilian targets in Ukraine. Good luck with that one. If Moscow then doesn't concede, Ukraine should be free to use already delivered weapons without restrictions. Now, what I find quite interesting about its proposal is not just its source in Germany, but the nature of that approach. Clear consequences of Russian escalation. Future historians will have to speculate about what would have happened if the West had adopted that approach from the start of the war, saying what it would do, what it would grant, what it would give if certain actions occurred by Moscow, such as, say, the use of chemical weapons or the striking of hospitals. That may, and I emphasise that word, have then acted as a deterrent for those activities occurring. Many would still have argued it would have been too reactive to do that rather than proactive. But it may have been more successful than what has been adopted, namely to be strategically ambiguous and only to give weapons or permissions once it was perceived as safe to do so, thereby ceding the strategic initiative to Moscow, as we've talked about many times. Now, one of the ways that the Kremlin has escalated in response to that apparent Western weakness has been the hybrid warfare conducted against European countries in particular, from cyber attacks to direct acts of violence since the full-scale invasion, something that intelligence chiefs MI5, MI6 and others have been really talking very, very vocally about in recent weeks. The Economist offers a good summary of what's been going on in their latest issue, calling it Putin's revolutionary plan of sabotage, arson and assassination. We will add a link in the show notes to that and another story connected to it about how a honeytrapped Irish politician spied for Russia during the Brexit saga. Now, I found this piece in the Sunday Times absolutely fascinating, to borrow David's phrase. It offers yet another example of Moscow recruiting European politicians seeking to, in this case, undermine relations between Britain, Ireland and the EU. Now, apparently, the Irish Security Service identified the agent who had been honey-trapped, but remarkably, the individual is still at large in the country's parliament. So a surveillance operation found the politician met a Russian spy, I'm presuming the honey trap, who worked at the Russian embassy in Dublin between 2019 and 22. That's an example, by the way, of why countries are incentivised to evict so many of those so-called Russian diplomats. Now, the Kremlin's recruitment of this agent within the parliament happened during a period of escalating tensions between Moscow and Dublin. As the Sunday Times says, until this point, Ireland was viewed as a permissive environment for Russia's intelligence services to operate in the EU compared with countries such as France and Britain. That changed in 2018 when the government moved to stop Russia from expanding its embassy after an investigation by the Times disclosed that the Federation was constructing an intelligence gathering base there. The government was forced to introduce emergency legislation to revoke the permission. So a really interesting story. And there you have it, Dom, a word of warning. In the rare instance that any glamorous ladies start talking to you at the pub, they're not taking a liking to your new pink shirt. They're just trying to get you to betray your country. Now, staying with Russia, its Defence Minister Borisov arrived in China for an official visit yesterday against the backdrop of bilateral naval exercises in the Pacific Ocean. Notably, the Russian Ministry of Defence published footage coinciding with his arrival of ongoing Russia-Chinese anti-submarine naval manoeuvres and claimed that a detachment of Russian and PLA naval vessels are conducting a joint patrol of Asia-Pacific region. China is running a whole load of naval exercises right now around Taiwan, and they've published videos showing how it could easily seize the island, they claim, were it its intention to do so. It has lots of big arrows. It's like the introduction of Dad's Army, if British listeners know what I'm referring to. It's rather bizarre. But evidently Moscow wants to play up its relationship with China at every opportunity. Meanwhile, it's doing its best, of course, Moscow, to subvert two important elections this month in Europe, in Moldova on the 20th of October and Georgia on the 26th, seeking to get a puppet government in the first and to maintain what many see as a puppet government in the second. In a sign of the direction of travel, Britain has just frozen its annual security dialogue with Georgia and cancelled other talks on defence over concerns about democratic backsliding, its term. Britain's ambassador to Tbilisi said in an interview published today, "I'd expected that we would work together to strengthen Georgia's resilience and our common prosperity. But over the past year, the Georgian government has chosen a different course." Pretty sobering analysis there, I think. Now, Europe is still seemingly in knots, frankly, about how to protect itself from Russian aggression, both in Ukraine and beyond. To speak to that, Tim Willesee CMG, who served for 27 years as a British diplomat all around the world, has published an opinion piece that's led to quite a lot of conversation this morning on the Royal United Services Institute website, where he comments on what he calls the impending betrayal of Ukraine. He says, and I quote, "The immediate peril comes from the 24 US presidential election, but the fundamental problem has been the failure of Europe to commit to the defeat of Putin's invasion. A newly elected President Harris could be expected to follow the path trodden by Biden. She would inherit his caution at unduly provoking Putin and his reticence about Ukraine joining NATO. Furthermore, her freedom to supply Ukraine with additional weaponry could be restricted by the makeup of the two houses of Congress. There could also be a third outcome, a Harris victory that is contested by Trump. In such circumstances, we could see an absence of US foreign policy for a period of weeks or even months." Now, that view won't be new to our listeners. We've talked about the caution, probably most likely, of even a democratic victory in November. But it's interesting to see that Russia are now saying this and publishing pieces like it. What would a betrayal of Ukraine look like, he asks. At least it would retain some 82% of its territory. But would Europe still have its appeal? He says, joining the Western club may have lost some of its sparkle at this point. Ukraine's corrupt oligarchs would re-emerge from hibernation were there a deal. The old post-Soviet cynicism could replace the enthusiasm of the Maidan generation. There would be antagonism towards those returning from abroad after avoiding the fight, and, of course, thousands of grieving families. Finally, he says, this should have been Europe's war to manage. In spite of decades of discussion about European defence, it proved too convenient to rely on the US. This made Europe a prisoner of US electoral factors. It also caused Europe to shirk the difficult decisions that helping win the war entailed. The big increases in defence expenditure, the 24-hour working in ammunition factories, the hikes in food and energy costs, and the political risks such as seizing frozen assets. What remains now for Europe is to secure a place at the negotiating table and to argue for NATO membership for Ukraine as part of any settlement. So a realistic, some would describe their assessment, a pessimistic for others, but it feels vitally important at the moment to be talking along these lines. And so it does feel like the right moment to bring in our guest. Today is Dom's worst nightmare, not one but two Francises in Telegraph Towers. Francis, it's great to have you on. Francis Farrell of the Kyiv Independent, of course. Welcome. We've cited your reporting from the front line for the Independent several times in recent weeks, but this is the first time we've seen each other in person since we were all together in Kyiv with David in February. You heard there that analysis published by Russia. Now, it bears repeating that Russia published many pieces offering different perspectives on the war, but nonetheless, it is interesting that they published this piece now. Does that tally with your own perspective? And what is your assessment of the military situation on the front lines at present?
Good day, Francis. Fantastic to be here in the office in London. I remember seeing the photo when the podcast was launched of the three of you on the glass stairs above this huge buzzing newsroom that you've got. And so to be here is wonderful, but yeah, of course, quite bittersweet without David. I was just in Pokrovsk when I heard the news, and I just finishing working with civilians and soldiers in this kind of place of looming apocalypse, and then to finish the day reading this news was quite heavy. And but it's just been so amazing to see the way you've continued. To go back to your question, it's interesting that we're seeing this kind of language more and more. Sobering, betrayal. I remember there was a piece, I think by Anne Applebaum, in The Atlantic not long ago about the abandonment of Ukraine. For me, who occasionally wrote some texts even a year ago about the fact that, defeat could still be an option if we continue to live in an alternate reality and we don't act decisively. I've been called Mr. Sobering quite a few times, but now it seems like the mainstream discourse is catching up, and that's extremely important. My immediate reaction to this kind of headline and this kind of text is from the context of working on the front lines and just watching the battlefield more, to be honest, than I do international politics. There are two almost separate things here, and one which was apparent for a while now could lead to another, which is far darker, and that is, of course, betraying Ukraine in the sense of not being able to empower it to victory, to the victory that it deserves, and the victory that the rules-based world order absolutely needs, the complete victory. So betrayal in attack, in counteroffensive, and in victory, that's one thing. But now, unfortunately, slowly it seems more and more clear that we could be staring down the barrel of betrayal in defense, because this is a war of attrition. Russia's aim is, first and foremost, to break independent Ukraine, and its plan to do that, although it's had plenty of road bumps on the way, is to break the ability of the Ukrainian military to defend along this huge front line. So now it's almost as if we're finally reaching that point of realization, but still sometimes in these articles and in these discussions, we seem to be stopping right before we reach the final logical conclusion, which is, why would Russia stop in any given scenario? Why does a bad battlefield situation mean, I guess we didn't get victory, now it's time for negotiations? But when we see the state of the front line at the moment, that's my fear. In the context of Zelensky and the victory plans, and those victory plans being met with skepticism, with European partners, saying, oh, well, it looks like he's just repackaging the same requests he's been made all the time. As much as I have a lot of criticism towards the way Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership have led this war in the past year, that aspect, that need to say we need to end it, we need maximum pressure now, is completely valid. But of course, all of this, in terms of what we can expect in the future, it's two completely different realities depending on the results of the elections in a few weeks.
Thanks, Francis. Yes, it seems that many European leaders in particular have been sitting on their hands waiting for the outcome of the US presidential election. But of course, what are the chances that it will go their way and it's a democratic victory? It may well be the most likely outcome at the moment, but it's still a long way to go. And it's a huge risk. It's a huge gamble. But Francis, just staying with the front lines, you've spent far more time there than most journalists. What is the mood there at the moment? How precarious is the situation in the places that you've been in recent weeks?
So over the front line, I guess the main dynamic movement, apart from the Kursk operation, of course, and we can get to that, the main dynamic movement throughout spring and then escalating over summer has been this Pokrovsk offensive. And we saw over August, which was when the Kursk operation was carried out at first, and then going into September, we saw a situation on the front line where Ukraine's defense was markedly out of control compared to how it had been over 2023, how it had been even over most of 2022, this kind of positional war where it's incredibly slow and costly for either side to take positions. You could see that the speed of the gains was something that we hadn't seen. And when I was there in September, you could hear about these reasons. The main reason is that these brigades that have been dedicated to defending little sectors of the front line are just in many ways quite exhausted. Manpower is down. We've heard all these things before. Just in this tug of war of resources, the formula that Russia has found, which is to level an area with glide bombs, with artillery, and to make moving around in that area next to impossible with suicide drones, accompanied with this never-ending stream of one little group of 3, 5, 6 infantrymen after another. It seems to work pretty well at overwhelming these positions if they can concentrate those forces and those fires enough. And what makes it worse is that Russia has also really realized that the advantage of targeting the weakest sectors of the front line, so those which haven't been fortified, but more importantly, those which are manned by a brigade or another battalion, which maybe is known to already be very exhausted or to have poorer command coordination or to be less well equipped, not only in terms of weaponry, but in terms of the quality and the professionalism of their respective drone unit, which each brigade has. What they do is they push in the weak spots, and unfortunately that ends up in the strongholds, maybe lines held by some really competent and still well-equipped, well-motivated brigades, can be more under threat from the flanks. I saw that in the town of Selidova, that's just southeast of Pokrovsk, and now right on the front line. When I was there, the troops from the unit, which was a National Guard unit, which had been moved there from Zaporizhzhia Oblast just a few days ago, they were fresh, they were motivated, they were doing a good job, but on each side they were worried because they had these brigades which were stuck there. Since then, we have seen that positions both to the north and south of their sector have been lost, and that has made the defense of Selidova a lot more challenging. It seems like one solution would be to have better rotation, to make it easier to have new brigades ready in reserve and then to rotate them out. But we also know how difficult that has been, even if we know Ukraine has problems with manpower, problems with reserves. But even if they have a unit that is ready to come in and take an exhausted brigade's place, Russia has also really, really honed in on noticing these rotations when they happen and attacking with everything they have to exploit them. And that makes these rotations really, really difficult to carry out in the first place, and often they just choose not to do them and best let the brigade stay there and fight for as long as possible. And a good example of that was what happened in Vuhledar. Just a few weeks ago, this one brigade, this legendary 72nd, which was holding this legendary, probably the most legendary of all these Donbass fortress cities, for a battle that lasted maybe more than 3 times as long as Stalingrad. There were thoughts of them rotating, as I know, but it was just too difficult. Plans were leaked, and they just had to stay there until the very end. And so what this all comes back to, that's the immediate problem. And when this problem gets exacerbated, this manpower, exhausted brigades, a lot of this is due to systemic mistakes within the Ukrainian political and military leadership with regards to mobilization, fortifications. We've talked about this before. But at the end of the day, where this brings us right now on the eve of the elections is a place where it's not about not giving enough for victory at this point, unfortunately, and it feels like this sobering reality needs to be voiced a bit more to have this kind of negative almost motivation to act more drastically in the West, which is the threat of Ukraine's defense of the front line, slowly having local collapses and then that just getting worse and worse. And that's why we see Zelensky realizing we need to act. But again, just very, very bad timing with these elections.
Thank you. And just a couple more questions from me before bringing in Dom. You were talking there about rotations, and just put us in the shoes, if you can, or should I say boots, of soldiers. How many are there for months and months without leave. And what's the general morale and mood like at the moment? Do they see them holding on? Do they see there being the prospect of a victory? Or is it pretty bleak at the moment, to put it frankly?
Both your questions. The first caveat I would always say is when it comes to the military, there is infantry and there is everyone else. There are those whose job is to sit on those very zero-line positions and hold them for really, as you said, for months at a time. And there are those who do their work further back, the drone people, the mortarmen, the artillery people, and so on. Their jobs are still extremely important, and often they do come pretty close to the front line. But that last few kilometers before the zero is the area that has just become so deadly. Because of that, often we can talk about months spent without leave, but it's also a question of sometimes weeks spent on those zero-line positions without once being able to leave because it's just simply too dangerous to stick one's head out. The zero-line positions that I visited, which were just up above Donetsk back in July, that was the last time I was with infantry like that. And they had a system where they were basically living there constantly. They'd lived there for a year. They hadn't really had leave, and they just rotated one guy at a time out of 7 or 8 each day of the week. And they got to go into town and rest and wash up and buy some supplies. And that was it. This kind of schedule of an infantryman looks very different in different brigades, depending on how well manned that brigade is, but more importantly, depending on what's going on in that sector of the front line. So there was a really tough infantry battalion fighting in Chasiv Yar, for example, where they famously spent 70 days just out there on positions, basically surrounded, getting resupplied only by drones before they were able to come out. So compare that to the work of mortars or drones, where they have a shift of perhaps a couple of days, and then they can still quickly jump on a car and ride back out to a city where they can rest up and then come back for another shift. It's completely night and day what that looks like. And I would say that night and day comparison looks pretty similar in terms of discussions of their morale. If you have a more or less stable job, even if it's dangerous, a couple of kilometers from the front line, you come in and out, you do your work, but you more or less know what you're going to get, and you can have a little bit of comfort, then that's one thing. You know, these people also have every right to be very tired and a little bit down on morale at this point, but it's the infantry who are in that hell the whole time, where you really have to worry about their mental state at this point. It's looking pretty bleak, but again, every time I meet people like this, you see they're not doing well. But there is also this stubborn, I don't know whether to call it resignation or just stubbornness in terms of, well, I don't have any other choice. We need to stop them here, or they'll come to my home, they'll come to my family. It's conditions which it's very hard to imagine ever living in, but that's the new normal for them, it seems.
Thank you. And one final question from me before Dom can jump in. We've spoken a lot on this podcast about Kursk, and you referenced it there. What has been the impact of the Kursk operation in terms of the front lines that you've been on? Have you heard from Ukrainian soldiers that their opposing forces, the Russian forces that are nearby, have been moved out because of the Kursk operation? Has there been a tangible impact, or do you think it's really not had perhaps the impact politically or especially militarily that was initially hoped?
Yeah, so we got the answer to this question about, I would say, between 3 weeks and a month into the operation. By then it was really possible to assess. That was when, at the large press conference of the Ukrainian leadership around Independence Day, he wasn't there in person, but Syrsky gave a briefing, the commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, to journalists online, and he even took two very quick questions, one of which was from CNN, I believe, about this exact topic, about the effect of Kursk on the rest of the front line, and particularly on Pokrovsk. And Syrsky admitted, he said it was quite astonishing, actually. He said that This was indeed one of the main aims of the Kursk incursion, to pull Russian forces away from other sectors, particularly the Pokrovsk direction. And then he said, and I quote, "The Russians, understanding this, did not do that. Basically, they took forces away from other areas. But when it came to Pokrovsk, where, as I said, Ukraine's defense was not stable, they only stepped up their attacks." So Syrskyi admitted this. And we see now, more or less, for those who track the Russian military very closely, they've reported that they have moved forces away from the Kharkiv area. They've moved forces from other low-intensity areas in Zaporizhia Oblast, and including even some areas in Donetsk. An artillery commander friend of mine who was fighting near Siversk, north of Bakhmut, said that the Kursk operation really did save them, because they were really pushed hard in that area, and the elite paratroopers from Tula, he said, the 106th Airborne Brigade, was moved from their area, including their very strong drone unit, to Kursk. But, of course, the downside, yes, the attempt to divert them from Pokrovsk didn't work, actually sped up their advances, as we all know and can see with the map now. It's hard to say, but the real problem, I think, is this stretching of the Ukrainian reserves as well, because not only did they need to gather reserves, quality fighting units, they used a lot of paratroopers for their initial incursion into Kursk, but now where a patient Russia has finally diverted a lot of forces to pushing them out, we've heard a lot of reports of increased pressure in that area. That just forces Ukraine to hold a lot more front line and to dedicate a lot more brigades to that. So it's tricky. It was undoubtedly brilliantly planned at the start, but it does seem like the strategic logic in this second phase is faltering.
Hi, Francis. A couple from me, please. You heard on my updates this report of Russian soldiers being using the cover of civilian clothes to attack in some areas, and we reported, I think last week or maybe the week before now, of this so-called human safari, where we see Russian forces using drones to attack civilians, particularly around Kherson, but we've seen it elsewhere as well. Are you able to comment on either of these? Have you heard of these? Because every time we report them, we say, look, we can't verify this, we've not seen it. You're obviously closer than we are. Have you seen any reports of Russian soldiers fighting in civilian clothes? And what can you tell us about this thing? It's called the human safari of Russian drone forces just directly targeting civilians, almost seeming like a sport.
Thanks for the question. There were reports way back in the Battle of Bakhmut, Wagner soldiers dressing up sometimes as civilians and sometimes in Ukrainian military uniform. I haven't heard of that personally here in this case, but it's again one of those things where there's no reason at all why you should put it past them, and any argument about morality, about international humanitarian law doesn't come up for them. If it seems to make sense to do something like that, again, we're operating in a frontline environment where everything is in view of drones, including some often pretty high definition drones. But in that environment, just moving around between one ruined house to another, one cellar to another, can be the most dangerous part of their week of work, more so than living or even fighting. In that sense, if they saw that gave them an edge, they would do it. As for the human safari, I know personally Kalin, who did one of the films lately, and we had Zarina's article about it posted on the Kyiv Independent. So they've been down there a lot more recently in Kherson. For me, my story with Kherson is that I've only been there twice, once during the liberation and once during this flood. It's odd that they've chose to do this so systemically and so brazenly there, and that the videos actually from the Russian drones are the ones emerging. Again, it's difficult to say much else about it except that this is coming from country and soldiers where those standards are not applied. Egged on by fascist Telegram accounts saying, yep, sounds good, nice work, boys, more of that. I don't know what the rationality of it is in Kherson particularly. It's a huge city that is that close. I guess that's why we might see more of it there than in other places. But it's something to keep an eye on and to record for posterity for sure.
Thank you. Now, a subject that I know is close to your heart. We've spoken about it before. We spoke about it when we visited you in Kyiv earlier this year. Fortifications and the apparent, well, certainly lack of energy in getting these things dug by Ukraine. And we've said it's very difficult when you're in contact with the enemy to dig that front line. Not impossible, but very difficult. Make yourself a target, or the engineering equipment, very, very high value target. But the second and third lines and any others you want to dig behind there, a few tactical bounds away, that in the relative calm, and it is all relative, I get that, I still don't see a huge amount of very extensive, coordinated, well-positioned fortifications. Have I got that wrong? Are these things there?
No, overall, if I'm going to give a yes or no answer, I'd say you haven't got that wrong. There was the big fortification building initiative that started at the beginning of this year, when finally the leadership woke up and realized that it seems like we're going to be on the defensive for a while, and that's an absolute minimum that we should be doing is digging fortifications. But from the start, as you mentioned, it was all in reaction. It was all scrambling to dig something in areas where Russia was already attacking with a lot of intensity, and in areas where Russia was already had a good view, not only of the front line, but of 10, 15 or more kilometers behind, enabling it to target excavation equipment and crews building fortifications. But also, because Ukraine is a democracy and a democracy with limited funds, the third lines of defense were all built by civilian contractors hired by the regional administrations. And they built hundreds of so-called platoon strongpoints, which is a network of trenches dotted with a few concrete reinforced bunkers. And in theory, these were meant to have been designed, not only designed by the military and the Ministry of Defense, but also planned in terms of where they would be built and put. And billions of hryvnia were dedicated to this. That's hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds. And they got to work, but not always in the right places. And often they built these things in the middle of a field where everything is visible. And what that meant, and we didn't see these larger, stronger concrete fortifications tested for a while. The Russians reached the line of them a little bit in Kharkiv when they had their offensive, but they didn't get that far. But it was in Pokrovsk, of course, in that area where Russian forces have really pushed deeper into their lines, where they actually finally came up against this line of much stronger fortifications, which should have been much stronger in theory because they were initially dug further back from the front line and they used concrete. But in practice, we saw that these fortifications did not necessarily work very well at all when they were placed in open fields. There were reports of soldiers not even wanting to use them, not even wanting to get in and man them because of that. And so that rendered them useless, and then the soldiers ended up digging their normal trenches further back in a tree line. But also it showed that, this is part of a bigger equation, which is about having adequate levels of manpower, properly manned units, and a proper battle plan complemented by the presence of fortifications, by the use of prepared lines of defenses. And when you have a situation where you have a defense that is not under control, where you have botched rotations being exploited by Russian forces, and when you have these really undermanned brigades, then those are certainly conditions in which, even if they were built well, the fortifications could not end up really working.
Well, thanks, Francis, and thanks, Dom, for your question there. I know Dom's just had to dash off to go and interview some soldiers. That's what they all say. But Francis, you are, of course, our guest today, so you have the very final thoughts. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
Firstly, I just want to say it's just really worth remembering that when it comes to the work of the podcast, and especially of David, when we always talk about, Ukraine fatigue in the West, people getting distracted, looking elsewhere, there is really no one who better summed up the fight against that from outside Ukraine than David, and I just want to thank him one more time for that. On that note, actually, when it comes to final thoughts about where we are, it goes back to my earliest thoughts, I guess, about your article and about what this future could hold. I've spoken to some Ukrainian officials recently, who know what it's like in the Stavka. This is the weekly meeting of Zelensky and his military leadership, and asking them what's the atmosphere really like there. They see it as a very heavy situation. They understand what it's like on the front line, and that they said at the end of the day, their understanding is that this winter will be truly hellish, not only on the front line, but with the energy situation, and that we'll need to just fight through this and see where we end up. But even after that, time moves forward, and this Russian push to just break Ukraine moves forward as well with it. And so I'm not happy that we are in this point, but I'm glad that we have started to use, I guess, almost the right language for it, and that slowly, I think, the policymakers realize that there is still a lot more to lose. Going back to Rutte's words about the message to Russia being that we will continue, continuing is what got us here. That's, I think, Zelensky's message with his victory plan. That's what I think, in general, Europe and the West and all of us who engage with Ukraine also, it's a time to take a pause and maybe not just continue, but step it up. And in that context, what you guys are still doing is truly remarkable, and it's good to be here.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter, now X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.